Welcome to the Living While Loving Your Child Through Addiction podcast. Today we have a guest, Carrie Wilkens, PhD. She is a psychologist with over 25 years of experience in the practice and dissemination of evidence based treatments for substance use and post traumatic stress. Dr. Wilkens is the co president and CEO of the CMC Foundation for Change, a not for profit with the mission of improving the dissemination of evidence based ideas and strategies to professionals and loved ones of persons struggling with substance use. The CMC FFC's team invitation to change approach is an accessible set of understandings and practices that empower families to remain engaged. I lost my place. There we are. And be effective in helping their struggling loved ones make positive changes. The approach has been widely used across the country and is utilized in trainings with laypeople and professionals. She is the co author of the award winning book, Beyond Addiction: How Science and Kindness Help People Change, a practical guide for families dealing with addiction and substance problems in a loved one based on principles of community reinforcement and family training, otherwise known as CRAFT, and co author of the Beyond Addiction Workbook for Family and Friends, evidence based skills to help loved ones make positive change. Dr. Wilkens is also the co founder and clinical director of the Center for Motivation and Change, a group of clinicians serving all ages in New York City, Long Island, Washington, D.C., San Diego, California, and CMC Berkshires, a private inpatient residential program for adults. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
So let's start with the beginning where you and Dr. Foote and Dr. Kozenki came together and built CMC in a way that looked very different than a lot of other treatment centers do. Like, how did you guys come together and get that idea to do something so different?
That's such a complicated question. There are lots of tendrils that are attached to the answer of that question, and I think probably different for all of us. But um, we were psychologists, and I was just talking to one of my new interns about how much has changed in the last 20 years because we all came together over 20 years ago, and I was in graduate school, and the substance use world and the mental health world at that time were completely separate, so in the trainings, like, and as when I was trained as a psychologist, we weren't even trained to ask about substance use. One of my first clients, I worked with her for a year. I use this example all the time. And I was getting all this supervision. She had anxiety, she had trauma, all of these things. My last session with her, she told me that she was drinking 2 bottles of wine a day. I had never been trained to ask about substance use, be curious about it. Like, it wasn't even part of any of our training. And I just was like, that can never happen to me again. Like that, I did this woman a disservice. I was just so mad at everything at that point. So I went and sought treatment, not treatment. I sought a training in a treatment program that had focused on addiction. And then I was in that space and nobody there was dealing with any of the mental health parts of it. They were only dealing with the substance use. So trauma, learning disabilities, ADHD, all the other things that often come along with substance use wasn't being talked about at all in that space. So all of us were just like, how do we bring these two worlds together? Because that's really what people need. And how do we create a system where the staff is trained to help people with the substance use and work motivationally? And at that time, all substance use programs were abstinence only. It was very 12-step. Like, there was just one way. Like, if you wanted to change your relationship with substances, it was one way to do it. And they didn't work with people who were ambivalent or maybe I want to stop drinking, but maybe I want to keep pot in my life, like that kind of more ambivalent state. The substance use programs wouldn't allow people to have goals other than abstinence. So we decided to create the Center for Motivation Change, which was staffed with clinicians who could deal with the co-occurring issues, help people with substance use, come at it from a lens, a motivational lens, a skills-based lens, and treat people who wanted to abstain, maybe really were clear about that, all the way to people who were just curious and were willing to talk about it and weren't sure about what they wanted to do. So it was just really, taking all of the science-based strategies that were being developed in kind of these like research institutions, but weren't in the treatment world, oddly. So wanted to do, we wanted to treat a wider range of people and provide good care. And here we are 25 years later almost.
That it feels good to hear that, because sometimes it feels like things aren't changing fast enough. But things, when I hear how different they were just 25 years ago, things are changing. So that gives me a little bit of hope.
Yeah.
But you guys just released the 10th anniversary edition of Beyond Addiction, How Science and Kindness Help People Change, which is one of my favorite books. Was my first introduction to craft. It was the first thing that I found that's, like gave me the freedom to just love my daughter and kind of follow my instincts. And those things felt natural to me, what I learned in the book. So it was such a huge relief for me. But since you wrote that book 10 years ago, what has changed in the science and understanding of addiction?
Well, I'll go back to what you just said, which is you find some hope in that things have changed. I'm going to keep saying that it's still not changing fast enough, right? We still got to be upset about how slow some things are changing, and keep pushing for that, because when we wrote the book, and, midway through the CMCs, like addiction programs still were not putting people on the medications for opiate use disorders. They weren't allowing people to stay on their mental health psychiatric medications. It was very black and white. You don't give drug addicts drugs, the kind of mentality, and discharging people hugely at risk for overdose. So part of writing the initial book was, and also nobody knew about craft. 10 years ago, we would give presentations. I'd give presentations to professionals and I'd say, like, who knows about craft in a room of 100 professionals? And there'd be like 3 hands up. Nobody knew about it. So we really just wanted to write Beyond Addiction to get the awareness of craft is a really effective set of strategies that family members can learn. And like you said, like, connect with their struggling loved one in a completely different way, and understand the problem in a different way and support them, right? And so that was we just wrote the book to try to get it out into the public's awareness, and I'm glad you found it. But in the so that was a kind of an introduction to craft, and helping family members understand the treatment landscape and understand how to ask treatment programs, how are you staffed? How do you actually treat co-occurring issues? How do you treat anxiety disorders? What medications do you allow? Like, we wanted to give families kind of a user map of, like, what questions to ask, and what role can you play? Because family members were also really excluded for the most part, and they still are, unfortunately. And then they were only given the message that you have codependency, you have a disease too, and detach, separate, are the way to help your loved one, which couldn't be further from the truth as far as I'm concerned. So, and their codependency, like, that isn't a thing. You line up 10 people who've been told they're codependent, and they are all completely different, and struggling with completely different issues. And so we just wanted to change that framing of things. And then in the last 10 years, we've, as you know, developed the invitation to change approach, which is really craft kind of. I sometimes joke around and say it's kind of craft on steroids. It's because we just spent so much time working with family members, trying to help them understand the strategies of craft. But if you're a layperson kind of in the world, getting all the stigmatized understandings of addiction, where you're told all of these things and you think a bunch of things about people with substance use disorders, if you try to learn craft, which is all about positive reinforcement and engagement, family members literally were feeling like, I can't do that. That goes against everything I've been told. That makes me enabling, it was confusing to them. So the invitation to change is our attempt to kind of help people understand the problem in a more robust way so that you can then feel comfortable and understand why the reinforcement strategies work so well, why the communication strategies are incredibly impactful in terms of how you can shape and shift somebody's motivation. So the invitation to change, it just adds more understanding to the mix. And then we also wanted to help family members understand themselves better, because craft has a whole self-care part of it, which is great. Everybody should take better care of themselves. But parents, and you know this all too well, like parents in particular, just the pain of trying to care for your child when they're struggling, that pain is immense. And the amount of self-compassion and self-understanding that caretakers need is way deeper than self-care. So we really wanted to make that more robust so that people could survive the helping process, essentially, and learn to thrive and take care of themselves while they're helping their loved one who may struggle for a very long time. So the second edition really kind of expands the the helping tools for family members, and then the science parts. We talk about the GLP-1s. We do a deeper dive into the co-occurring issues. So it's more robust, the second edition, in terms of what we now know about the importance of treating ADHD, the importance of treating trauma, all of these other things. So it's just been expanded, and refreshed.
Yeah. I love that you included questions to ask the treatment centers because that one is, you know, when the first time I finally got my daughter to agree to go to treatment, she was 16 and I didn't know those questions to ask. And I made the decision a little bit from a place of fear. I didn't listen to my instincts. And so because it didn't go well at all, it took me 5 years
Mhm.
to, get her to wanna go again because it felt like, "Oh, this doesn't work," and, this place really didn't wanna help me, and so I think giving families the questions to ask to find a place that is a good fit
Mm.
for their person that they're looking for, 'cause, treating it as individual, like each person has unique needs. I think just even giving that permission to advocate and kinda take control of the process instead of feeling like, the treatment center or somebody else should have more control than you, the way it's kind of like that role reversal. For a long time, it's been like you said, like, "Oh, families are a problem, and they don't know, and they need to stay out of it," but now, like, that gives them permission to be involved and gives them a way to be involved that's really productive.
Yeah. No, I think the power has been in the experts, right?
Mhm.
Like the experts telling you what you should do, versus the quote unquote experts being able to say, "What do you know about your kid?" Right? Like, your kid their whole life. Like, what do you know? What do you know about why they might be using? What have you tried? What's worked? What's not worked? How are you as a helper? All of these questions to help the person, the parent, helping, trying to help, be able to step back a little bit because, when you are terrified or you're really mad because your kid's doing a bunch of stuff that is really maddening and scary, it can be hard to take that pause and slow down and give yourself permission to kind of really be like, "What do I know?" And most parents, they know a lot, and that, like, I can use that information to help you turn around and then help your kid. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most pivotal
Yeah.
changes.
So I came up with a few of the common questions, like the things that I find parents struggle with the most. One of them is fear of relapse and feeling like if that happens, that all hope is lost, all progress is lost. So, how can you help parents reframe that? And then, if it does happen, what is, a good approach for them to be helpful and supportive?
Yeah, and that was such a good question because, it's a question that people will say, right? Like, what about relapse? That looks like a straightforward question. That's a question that is gonna be different for every single person. And for me to say, "Here's the answer," right, would just that's the setup for people to have real misunderstandings of the learning process because one of the Like, I don't even use that word. I tend to kind of talk about like a return to old behavior versus engaging in new behavior, because substance use is a learned behavior. Like, whoever's doing it, they learned that it works for them in some way, right? That behavior makes sense for them. It feels a certain way. It does something for them, because we don't repeat things that we don't get something from, right? So if somebody's doing something again and again and again, must work for them in some ways. So understanding that, because that will then help you be like, okay, what are potential other behaviors that can replace that? What skills might you need that can make it so that you don't have to turn to the alcohol? You've got a bigger toolbox, that you can turn to manage your stress, manage your anxiety, whatever it is that the alcohol is helping you with. So we need to help them. There's a bunch of skills around learning not to go to the old behavior, and then they got to learn a bunch of new behavior, right? So a relapse tends to be these moments in time where people got ambivalent because the old behavior became compelling again, right? They're like, I know it works for me, so I'm going to go back to it, which for me says there's something over here in the new behavior that you don't know how to do well. Like, what are you struggling with? How do we keep you over in the learning new behavior? And I don't think people really underestimate how much learning needs to happen for somebody to really change their relationship with substances. It's a profound amount of learning new things, and learning not to engage in the old stuff. And I think if you can kind of understand it through that lens, it can really shift how you respond to those returns to old behavior. The other thing is, if you get mad or you panic in response to somebody relapsing or returning to an old behavior, you may be setting the stage for them to go underground and hide it from you. They're going to be like, oh, that's really upsetting to them, so I'm going to hide it, versus staying above ground and being curious about it. Why are you going back to that behavior? What's happening for you? Might actually set the stage for a conversation versus you relapsed, all your good work is done, like you failed, you must not be wanting to really change, right? Like, that kind of response is going to create a rupture in your ability to talk with your loved one about what's really happening. So you're in the dark and your loved one is underground. I want to help people like keep everything above ground, by figuring out, how do we talk about this? I, as a caretaker, might not like what you have to tell me, in terms of why you went back to that old behavior. That might be really upsetting to me, but how do I stay with it and work with it, so that I can keep this conversation going and keep this connection going?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Does that?
Yeah, absolutely. And having the skills that we need as a parent to hear those things, like to be prepared, like where I say, well, I just want them to be honest with me, but us being really prepared for that honesty and having a way to manage how uncomfortable it is for us to hear those things is really important too. Um, so what I liked about what you said about just how much work it takes to learn new behaviors is that I think there's this myth that if a person is struggling to stay in the new behaviors and goes back to the old behaviors, that it's because like they don't want it or they weren't working hard enough or they did something wrong. So a person can be doing all the things and working really hard and still return to old behaviors.
Yeah, for sure. And being curious about what they might be struggling with, because you know, if I use a substance to manage my anxiety, maybe I have panic, maybe I worry all the time, maybe I can't sleep, right? There's a whole bunch of skills I can learn to manage that anxiety in a different way, but they take time. They don't work very quickly. They take a lot of practice, whereas having a drink or smoking a joint, fast, easy. I know exactly how it's going to work. So you're competing with the powerful reinforcement of substance use in particular. I always tell family members, one thing to be aware of is your love and connection is really powerful. The quick impact of substances, really powerful, right? You are literally competing with that as a reinforcement. So, and that feels really good really quickly. So you want to try to create an environment for your loved one where being connected to you feels good too,
Mhm.
or being in the family or being in a new hobby or being in a new behavior can start to feel good, and realize that that quick, powerful feel good thing, it's always in their memory banks. It's always waiting to some extent.
Mhm.
And I just think that's an important thing to be aware of, as a family member in terms of kind of what you're competing against. It's not doesn't feel awesome to frame it that way, but I think that's what's happening, a fair amount of the time.
Yeah, and understanding that helps me to have more compassion that how hard it must be to turn away from that thing that's such an easy answer.
Yeah.
So another thing that I see families really struggle with is the idea of choice, which is really oversimplifies something very complex. But I see people say or hear them say all the time, like, well, they just have to choose not to. They, have to choose their family over their substance or whatever it is. So, is there like a more helpful way to look at it than thinking of it as a choice or not?
Yeah, I thank you for saying that is a oversimplification of a very complex process, because especially for people who've used substances for a long time, the impact on the brain and the neural wiring and their neurotransmitters and their body, like there's actual physiological things that have happened that make it not feel like such a choice, right? There's a lot of habit, there's a lot of things happening in a person's body that kind of you can almost think about it as like hijacking their choice. Like because choice implies like I can make a rational, clear decision, right? I'm weighing my costs and my benefits and I'm choosing this thing over here. If my brain has been kind of remodeled, altered by chronic substance use, it doesn't feel like a choice. It really doesn't feel like a choice for people at a certain point. Over time, it can start to return to feeling like a choice as they get more kind of capacity to withstand their impulses and withstand cravings, and their brain chemistry gets resettled. But that can take a while. And so that's for the people who've been really caught up in substance use. That's just something to not forget about the physiology of it. The first part of the invitation to change model is something called helping with understanding, and the first thing is that behaviors make sense. So to really be able to slow down and be like, what does that behavior do for my loved one? What do they get out of it? What pulls them to it? Because that can give you a huge clue to why that choice might be hard for them. It looks like a clear choice to you. There's something about it that's making it really hard for them. And the more you understand that, then you can start to put things in front of them and have some compassion for that struggle and not take it personally, because it can feel like you're rejecting our family, right? You're choosing this thing over here, versus being like, wow, that thing does something really powerful for you. You don't sleep without it. You don't know how to be social without it. You feel jumpy in your body. You have PTSD and I didn't know it. Whatever it is, you have ADHD and you don't have great breaks in your brain. There's 1,000 different reasons why people use substances. And it's really important to slow down and try to understand what that is for your loved one. Because it can map out every next step that you take.
Yeah, so maybe more instead of why are you making this choice? How does this make sense?
Yes.
What problem does it solve?
Yeah. 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 How
Yeah.
do you think? What's compelling about it? What pulls you to it? I want to understand you. I want to understand your relationship with it. And that goes back to what you said of like sometimes as a helper asking those questions, you know, you don't want that to be the answer. It can be really scary. It can be really disheartening. So to kind of get yourself in an emotional place where you can, and that's where the values part of the invitation to change come in. It comes in terms of like really being able to give people permission. And it sounds like that's what you were able to do as a parent, is to shift and be like, wait a minute, my value as a parent is to be connected to my daughter, right? Like that's the most powerful thing. I want a relationship with my daughter. So being able to then inform your decisions with that core value in place, so it might be like, I really want to be connected to my loved one and I want this relationship to go well. So I'm going to deal with this painful conversation because I want to know these things so I can stay connected so I can help. Right. So you just want to help people understand why they're doing these difficult things as a helper too, because it can just ground you when you get frustrated or scared.
And I love the values piece because I had never thought about that before. Like, if I had really been in touch with my values and somebody even said, "What are your values in this situation?" And I identified, like, my connection with my daughter is my biggest value. I want to have a good relationship with her, whatever's available to me. Um, I wouldn't have done the things that I did in the name of tough love because that's what I had to do. Had I been guided by my values. But once I had that, idea that the kind of mom that I wanted to be, it was possible to be that kind of mom and not be hurting her. That was the disruption for me that was so hard, was if I was wanted to be loving and kind and connected, then I was somehow hurting her. And that causes so much more pain, and I see so many parents relieved by, and they learn about craft or invitation to change by, like, I don't have to hold back anymore, and I can be the kind of parent that I want to be, and I don't have to worry that I'm hurting them
Yeah.
as I'm being that parent.
Yeah. It like literally makes my heart hurt that you felt that and that that message is still out there so strongly because it's just,
Mhm.
I say it all the time. Like, I've never met a parent who can take on board the message that you need to distance yourself from your kid, right? Like, that's like soul crushing to a parent, like you can be like, okay, I'm going to try to do what this expert is telling me to do, but like it literally hurts your heart and doesn't make sense, right? So you're being asked to do something that just makes no sense versus being able to give permission to figure out what kind of helper do you want to be? Like, what do you think your kid actually needs? What's actually going on with your kid? What resources do you have? Like, and because I say all the time, like, not everybody's going to seek treatment. There are entire communities that that's not where the healing happens, like the rehab's not going to fit. It's just like knowing you, your family, and your community and what is going to work for your family and giving people permission to think that way is hugely needed, just, and I think that's what your podcast and, all these empowered parents who are now saying, hey, there's other ways to think about it. It's awesome that you guys are doing this. Just helping parents and people know it doesn't have to be one way.
Yeah, no. And I think what we were talking about earlier with really trying to understand how somebody's behaviors make sense and the open, connected conversation that requires. There's also this fear of, if I talk openly about this and I don't punish or do anything about it, am I enabling?
Yeah.
Like, I
What's
can't.
how condoning it? Yeah.
Yes, it always goes back to fear. I mean, parents are just terrified of enabling because you hear all the time, don't enable. And it's this blanket statement that anything good that you do that's helpful is enabling. And so it doesn't give parents a framework to decide what's right for them and for their kid in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think those words like codependent, enabling, tough love, like they're these catch-all phrases that are just disorganizing and confusing for people. Because the enabling one in particular, like you said, like I think it sends this message, I can't love my kid, I can't be connected, versus like being able to step back and be very strategic, actually, and be like, I'm gonna I'm gonna use our relationship to be connected so I can understand you. And then I might have to set some limits, right? Because maybe there's something chaotic happening that I don't want to happen in my house, because you've got siblings or, that's just not our family value. So that can't happen in the house. So you can set limits. You can tell people what's okay and not okay, but how you do it, the tone you do it in, and then how you validate and understand what's going on for them and say, like, I know you're struggling with something. I want to be connected to you. This can't happen in my house. So you can't be in my house right now,
Mm.
but I'd like to connect with you tomorrow. or I'd like to see you on Friday, or, whatever it is. It's just giving people the capacity to be strategic in what they're reinforcing, how they're communicating. And like I said, just giving permission to, I love you. I love you every day. You're doing something I really feel scared about, but I love you.
Mhm.
We can have this conversation, right? So I think those are just the really subtle, powerful things that parents can do when they have the right frame and the right skills and permission to use them.
Yeah, I was able to start doing, like, I call it a yes for a no, where anytime I would say no to her, I would always have a yes that felt good to me, which was usually like food or, so I'll do your laundry, something along those lines that could help keep connection and help with some of the pain of having to say no in such a really hard situation. But I wouldn't have been able to even have that yes part in there
Mm.
before when I felt my answer always had to be no unless she was ready to go to treatment and commit to abstinence for the rest of her life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the invitation to change that frame also gives people kind of the awareness, is the way you just said, like, if you don't go to treatment and if you don't commit, there's no conversation happening, right? Like, it's just there's one answer and that's it. Versus being able to be like, we're somewhere in this process of you changing, and I'm trying to understand the change process. I'm trying to change. I'm supportive of change, and that may happen over months and months and months. It's not like there's some right answer here, because that's the other thing that I think puts enormous amount of pressure on families, is that there's a right answer versus being able to be like, this is really messy. This is really complicated. How do I take care of myself? How do I use skills so that I can have this go as well as possible? Given that especially if it's an adult child, I don't have control. I- They're in the world on their own. I don't have control. So, which is terrifying. Because that's the other thing. And I think it was in one of your questions. People try to control things, understandably, and and sometimes you have to control. Are you drinking and driving? You can't have the car, right? So sometimes you have to make decisions like that. But the idea that I can somehow control another person, I think, is just tragic for family members. It just exhausts them and creates so much friction. And there's just other ways to have influence.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And even when my daughter was a minor, like she was not going to be controlled in any, she would just run away. Like that was her ultimate control if I pushed too hard and I didn't have the tools to approach things from another reasonable way. I just have we have one goal, and that's you've got to go to treatment. You've got to do, kind of that all or nothing black and white way of looking at things. So it didn't feel like there's just like a whole world of possibilities for how we can approach things. But when you only have one, it just creates so much desperation for everybody that it just made everything so much worse. And it made me feel like a horrible mom because why can't I control my kid
Mm.
like everybody's telling me I should be able to?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I'm sorry those things happened. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
excessive.
So, when parents feel like they've tried everything, and it feels like nothing is working, they don't know what else to do. How can turning to a book like the Beyond Addiction book help them?
I mean, I think it depends on what the everything is, because most people have gotten the advice that you are describing, or some version of that. And so when you kind of give them a different way of understanding and awareness that these communication strategies are really helpful, and they're going to help with your loved one, they're going to help in your life in general, just like learning compassion for yourself and understanding, like, this is you if a parent is in front of me saying, I've tried everything, I'm usually sitting there saying, hey, you must be exhausted. You're probably exhausted. And part of your, like, I tried everything And now I feel like giving up is because you're exhausted and you're emotionally depleted. So how do we like help build up those reserves? Some so that if you decide you want to go back and try some new strategies, you actually have. And some families have been really harmed by their loved ones. Like people who are using substances, they do really destructive things in families. So maybe your loved one has stolen from you. Maybe your loved one has physically harmed you, really scared you, wrecked your car. All spent money that you didn't have. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that family members get really depleted. So to be able to kind of treat somebody in that place tenderly and just kind of encourage them to like just assess where are you right now in terms of being depleted. So is this a I'm depleted state of being, or is this of I don't have the skills or the understanding to kind of maybe try. So you want to kind of be looking at those two things. And there are times when people get to the place where, I mean, in the last half of the book, there's a couple paragraphs about it may be that you really have tried everything, and your loved one really might not change. And to deal with the grief of that, to deal with all of that in a tender way for yourself is also something that like these community groups and when parents and family members get together, they can actually honor that pain too. And sometimes you'll get that support and then you'll realize like, oh, I want to try again, or if my loved one came back and reengaged, I see their face and yeah, of course I want to try to be connected. So it's just a process. And it can be such a painful one for people, but the I tried everything usually is you didn't actually know about a bunch of these other skills and like why don't we try them and just see what happens.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think the parents were plagued with the it's not working, because like you said, it's so messy. Change is so messy and there's a lot of back and forth and up and down. And what we're doing can be helping, and yet things are still really messy. I think that's why it's so helpful to have support to be able to see those things. And like you mentioned, eh, honoring what a hard experience that is as a parent, being in the middle of it. Like when my daughter was really starting to change after I started using craft, it when I was in the middle of it, it didn't seem like as much change was happening as now when I look back on and I'm like, wow, she was really making big changes. But because it still didn't look like I would have liked it to, and it wasn't wrapped in a neat bow, it felt like it wasn't working.
Yeah.
So perspective is
Yes.
so important there too. But we need rest and all these other things to be able to even get that.
Yeah, and I think these family support groups where you can get that perspective, because I say to a lot of the family members that I work with, I worked with this couple for a very long time. The son has very serious mental health issue. He's probably never going to stop smoking pot and, probably is never going to function very well just because of his mental health issues. And the dad started out very much like you're describing of like, he just needs to stop and he needs to go to rehab, and we're 5 years into this. They check in with me once a month. They go to a family support group and he'll get on and he'll tell me all the things that are wrong. And one of the things I do once a month is I say, okay, he hasn't been hospitalized in this many months. He had a nice interaction with you and, he showed up for dinner and I see all these things that 2 years ago weren't happening. How do we help you hang on to even 6 months ago, X, Y, and Z wasn't happening, but it's so gradual. And there's so much chaos around it sometimes for some of these families, these support groups where somebody else can say, hey, I know you're really depleted and I know you're really scared and frustrated. And I also heard you saying X, Y, and Z about the positive changes that have happened for your, the little step. We call them successive approximations. It's just like those little steps forward that over time are significant, but they just feel kind of meaningless in the moment, but they're so not. So that perspective is really important.
Yeah, and it's so hard when you're in that space. I can just remember like when I was trying to get help before I really started, about the 5 years that I was desperately looking for something like craft. And just constantly telling everybody what was wrong. And because I didn't have anything other than to like, I was just, it was my plea for help,
Yeah.
and it's when I hear parents do that, I just have so much compassion because it comes from a place of just wanting to have some tools to feel somewhat like you can be helpful at all.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we haven't talked about it yet, but using substances and then getting in trouble with substances, like using them in a problematic way, becoming dependent on them. Substance use disorders are one of the most stigmatized problems to have. Like, nobody wants to be an addict, and no family member wants to have a loved one with an addiction problem because it's a stigmatized problem, and families are stigmatized if their loved one has a problem. Literally, they've done studies on, if a child has a parent who has a substance use problem, other parents won't want their kids to play with that kid. So that kid is suffering. You know, there are studies done that parents are blamed for their loved one, for their kid's substance problem. So nobody wants that, right? You want to hide from that. You don't want anybody to know. Instead of being able to look through the lens of using substances is a behavioral choice, as is gambling, as is video gaming, as is, eating foods that cause your blood pressure to be, a risk. I mean, there's all sorts of things that humans do that aren't good for us, right? Substances are very obvious and very destructive, but people are doing them because they work in some way. They're just being human beings. And like the more we can kind of just have compassion for that we're human and that we struggle and that your child is struggling and you're struggling and you don't need to hide it and there's no quick fix. It's a behavior that needs to be shaped and changed over the course of time. And new learning needs to happen. And the more people can kind of approach it through that lens instead of saying, it's bad, you're bad because you're using this, and you're a bad parent because your kid has this problem, we'll be helping so many more people and reducing shame and reducing stigma. So I just encourage all of your listeners to also just realize the impact of stigma because it's caustic. It's horrible and infused in every part of your experience as a parent.
Yeah, and even when we're trying to overcome all the ways we've been conditioned by stigma, we're still getting more of it every day from movies and TV and what you hear on the radio and it's everywhere still.
Yeah. 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 So I think having some compassion for that too, because that just creates all this tension and pressure and, just jams everybody out. So
Yeah. So, where's the best place to buy the book? And if somebody wants to support CMC Foundation's nonprofit work, how can they do that?
sure. The website is cmcffc.org. So the foundation is a nonprofit that all funds raised allow us to scholarship family members to come to invitation to change trainings. We go into communities that may not be able to afford us to come in for a training, so it just allows us to scholarship and develop resources that we're then giving to people in communities who need and want it. And there's a resources page on there. And the resource page on that website, there's a book page. You can get the book there. And in addition to the workbooks, there's also a communities group page with lovely people like yourself who are doing invitation to change groups across the country. So you might be able to find a free support group that you can try out. People like yourself who've been trained and started groups in their communities. So we're just trying to that you can sign up for the newsletter. You can, donate there. There's like that is a hub for lots of things. And if you sign up for the newsletter, you get monthly nice things to do and, nice supports as a family member, but also get announcements of upcoming trainings that you can sign up for.
Yeah, you guys have like grand,
Like
like,
Mondays, family Monday,
yeah,
is lunch and learns. Like there's just all sorts that we're trying to make it accessible that people can get these skills in whatever time allotments they might be able to carve out in their lives.
Yeah, because a lot of times I'll see those and send them to my clients. I'm like, I think that this one looks like one you'd be interested in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So before we wrap up, was there anything that we didn't cover that feels like really important to go over?
Uh, no, other than just I think the self-compassion piece is just one that can't be underestimated, and that is not part of craft. And the it's bigger than self-care. Like the kindness, being able to bring that to yourself. When you as a helper are having a hard time, having some compassion for your loved one when they're having a hard time and they're struggling with the behaviors or whatever it is about the change process. The compassion piece of this is probably one of the most important because like it creates the conditions where people can learn new things, right? If we're harsh, if we're critical, if we're demanding, if we're time pressured, if we're all these things, that isn't an environment where people can learn new things, and stumble and trip up and need more help or whatever it is. So I think, and that includes for the helper too. There's so many family members who are like, I went and tried to use this communication skill and I ended up yelling and losing my temper. Okay. Like, let's help figure out what was going on for you in that moment. Like, how do you go back and acknowledge, like, I was trying something new and I didn't do it so well. I want to try again. Like, that's modeling behavior change for your loved one too, which I think can be hugely impactful. So don't underestimate. It's the hardest part actually, because people are very harsh on themselves. Like you ask people what they're saying to themselves in their minds, and it's pretty harsh. So just self-compassion, dive in, learn about it. It's Kristen Neff's website, selfcompassion.org, has an enormous amount of resources to just develop that particular skill too, which I just want to plug to your audience.
Yeah, when I'm doing the invitation to change, the self-compassion part is probably the hardest for
Yes.
people to get. And it's, because it does get confused with self-care.
Mhm.
Um, but if I'm going on a walk that I consider self-care, but beating myself up the whole time, then it's totally counterproductive. And it does take so much practice to really reframe that way of having that kind inner voice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because it may be that you're going on that walk and you're like, I'm really suffering. I'm really having a hard time. This is really painful. Right. And people, that can be really hard to give yourself permission to just acknowledge that that's what's happening. Uh,
Mhm.
but I promise you, it will put more gas in your tank if you
Yeah.
take that strategy for yourself.
Yeah, it's so helpful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this episode with me today.
Thank you for having me.